All right, well, welcome everyone to our Resource YYC Lunch and Learn. Today we have Copoint presenting with Elliot and Aaron, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Great, awesome. Hello. So yeah, my name is Elliot. I'm with Copoint. I'm executive VP. I've been with the company for about 7 years. It's a family business. My parents started it back in the 80s, and they've since retired and so on. I was working in oil and gas for a number of years before joining the company in 2016. Basically we'll be here to talk about the specific program I work on, which I'll get into in more detail, but I'll pass it on to Erin, my colleague Erin, to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Erin, project manager at Copoint. I started with Copoint just September or August this year, but I've been working in project management for about 7 or so years. I started in the environmental world, and then got the opportunity to join Copoint and jumped on it. So happy to be here and looking forward to learning more about what you do, Abby.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know, Abby, if you want to, I don't know the context of this being recorded.
I feel very special here because I'm the only one here.
Yeah, this might be less of like a webinar and more just a chat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I finished my PhD last year. No, not last year. Feels too fresh. 2021, and then back with my background, I looked for industries where I can get in. I had got in 2020 Seed Labs, which had been in business for seed testing, and we provide certification for multinational companies for their seed quality and other purposes for import and export. We are also ISTA, and I don't know if you guys know ISTA, but it's International Seed Testing Agency. So it's a very regulated business, and the research in industry setting is very, very tough in the sense that you have to bring in money and everything has to be streamlined. So that's why I'm here to learn from you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for joining. And Paul, as you may be able to tell, it's a pretty intimate room here. So, if you want to introduce yourself, feel free. If you'd rather not, that's also fine. But
if it's okay with you, I would rather not. I'm really
that's totally fine.
And to learn what I can. Thank you.
Sure. So quick recap, Paul. My name is Elliot with Copoint, and my colleague Aaron is a project manager with Copoint. So we're here to talk to you about this program that we work with called the SHRED program. Some people refer to it as SRNED. The acronym stands for Scientific Research and Experimental Development. But from here on out, we're just going to call it what we call it in our office day-to-day, which is SHRED. So we'll dive into SHRED and how it helps to offset the risk of innovation. So SHRED 101, basically this program disperses a fair amount of money to Canadian businesses, or I should really say companies that have operations in Canada, to the order of more than $3 billion per year. That's the kind of the minimum level that we've seen in the last 30 years. But in some years it has dipped above or peaked above $4 billion. So it's fairly significant. It's the largest source of federal government money that goes towards encouraging, especially industrial innovation in Canada. Meanwhile, all provinces, pretty much, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, have a provincial incentive which kind of layers on top of the federal program. So we will talk about the Alberta program. But for a lot of our purposes, we're just going to think about the program in the federal sense, in the way that it's administered federally by the Canada Revenue Agency. And basically, the idea is that any companies operating anywhere within Canada, whether it's Nunavut or Toronto, would qualify if they kind of meet some criteria, and they get kind of this base level amount from the federal government. And then any provincial amounts can be kind of added on top of that. But I think the big question that we might want to ask ourselves is, why does it matter? And the big message is that basically SHRED is a program that offers, it has no risk associated with it. And it's a pardon me, sorry, it is a non-dilutive support system to help grow your business. So basically, if you're doing work that qualifies for it, there's really no risk to applying for it to get that money back. And it doesn't, from a private sector, a privately owned company's perspective, it doesn't dilute your ownership, which would happen in the form of, say, taking on more equity or more investors. And then I think the other important aspect to think about is, what does it take to participate in the program? And the message I want to carry home is that there's really minimal opportunity cost to participating in the program. So basically, there's not a lot of effort required on your part in order to basically access this money that's on the table for you. Aaron, did you have anything to add to? Yep. Okay, great. But I will say that it's available to all industries. And Aaron, if you want to just take us through some of the broad scope of industries that are eligible.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of at the inception of our Copoint's world, we worked a lot with energy companies, but this program applies across the board. I think the recent stats federally is actually 30% of claimants in the last 12 months, or maybe it was last fiscal year, were actually software applicants. We do see a lot of agricultural claims, which it sounds like, Abby, you're kind of in that space. Clean tech continues to grow as an industry that's claiming a lot of SHRED funding. And then we do also see medtech and life sciences. Usually the manufacturing work is somewhat related to energy, but there's manufacturing kind of across the board in any industry that's applying as well. But yeah, we're seeing lots of growth in agriculture and software specifically for SHRED. And the key point being is maybe people traditionally thought of SHRED as like an oil and gas or like very big spend type thing, but it really does apply across the board to almost any industry. Yeah, we can usually find a way.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I guess the first kind of step when we're thinking about the SHRED program is, okay, so we've got this incentive program that supports technology development or R&D in Canada. You might ask, okay, so then what does it take to kind of get to the place where my project is actually eligible? So a project, the serious framework for thinking about eligibility comes down to two really big buckets. So the first bucket is why is the project being done? And the second part is how is the project being undertaken? So I boiled it down to two very kind of cheeky little comments. If you think about it from a why perspective, you can really basically think about it as like you wanted to learn something sciencey, and we are going to get into the details about what that means. But that's a very kind of just a humorous, don't take us too seriously kind of comment. And then the second part is, how did you go about doing it? You can really boil it down to thinking about how you did this project intentionally and in a systematic way. So that is in contrast to throwing everything at the wall and just seeing what sticks, or randomly trying by trial and error without really thinking about the underlying, like why is this happening? What are some of the scientific principles at play that might be driving this outcome for my project? So we're really thinking about it in the terms of a technical problem versus a business problem. So I want to distinguish this from being, we tried to come up with something that had never been done before, but it was, like, let's say that we want to try selling lemonade on Stephen Avenue, downtown Calgary, and no one has had a lemonade stand on Stephen Avenue. It's like, there's no real element of, although it may be like novel that no one's tried to sell lemonade on Stephen Avenue, there's no technical uncertainty as to whether or not that's going to be a successful project. It might be more of a question of like market fit. And so just when you're thinking about these projects, don't think of it in terms of research being like market research or business research. It's more to do with the scientific or technical elements of a project. So let's step through the first part, which is why. So I'm getting rid of the sciencey part, and this is the actual kind of framework that we use to think about and how the Canada Revenue Agency, the CRA, thinks about these projects. So they want to understand that if your project can qualify, if the reason why you're doing the project is for the purpose of advancing your company's scientific knowledge or achieving some kind of technological advancement. So what that, you can further think about that or break it down as thinking about the generation or discovery of conceptual knowledge that helps to advance your understanding of science and technology more broadly. So it can't just be, we did this little thing and it tells us that we can do X, Y, Z in a very specific context. It's, the relationship between X and Y was poorly understood, and this test or advancement helps to delineate this relationship between these two variables. And so you can kind of think about it as like the underlying principles or foundation of knowledge, not just, we flipped a switch and the result was this, and we didn't really think about why it mattered. The second part is that, the project was undertaken because new knowledge is needed when it's uncertain whether a given objective can be achieved or how well it can be achieved. So that can be like, it wasn't even sure if this was even possible, or we kind of had a good idea that it was possible. We didn't know how effective it was going to be. So we didn't know the degree to which it would be successful or the percentage of success that it might have. So basically you look to the public sphere, which is if you gathered a room full of status quo engineers in your field who kind of work in this area. And if everybody kind of agrees that like, yeah, this is pretty standard, this is really rote industry practice that like everybody does this, that's not really anything that's not really going beyond what is standard industry practice. But if you gather those peers and you look to, common internet forums for a solution, and it's not clear whether this knowledge has been really proven and tested and established as being, yes, this is the standard by which our industry does something, then you're starting to really push the boundaries of your sector, and you're stepping into a new territory. I'll maybe pause there. Aaron, did you have anything to add on that side? Maybe we can pause just for questions on whether that's landing, if that makes sense for people.
Yeah, I guess another way to frame it is like, are you trying to solve a problem that's very difficult to solve, that you're spending a lot of time and money, and it's not a clear path, like you're kind of working in a fog, that like, and trying to like stepwise figure out, that's kind of the next criteria, the how, but the why being, we don't know and we need to figure it out in order to get to some sort of product or kind of next step in our business. So usually, sometimes I like to refer to this why as almost like the anti-pitch. If you're in a business role or you're talking to people and you're talking about how great your product is or your company is, and we do everything extremely well and reliably, we want like the why is actually the inverse of that. What's really challenging? What have you not figured out? What are you trying to solve in order to advance your product or your business?
Yeah, totally. Okay, feel free to interject, either of you guys, if you have questions. But let me step on to the next part, which is the how. So how did you go about doing this project? So the language that we talk about this framework is a systematic investigation or search by means of experiment or analysis. So what that really gets at is kind of core to like a high school science project. You can think about going back to your grade 10, maybe like Chem 20 class, and thinking about having a hypothesis or a proposed solution that we think this idea is going to work. And this is our starting point for what we're going to try to experiment with. And then you have kind of the testing of that. You're going to design a way to isolate and kind of understand, does my solution work? So in a software setting, that might be, we're going to run this program or this code or this new algorithm under certain parameters, under certain operating conditions, with like this amount of data or this amount of resource resourcing with memory and so on. And we're going to test to see how well it performs. And we're going to see how quickly it runs, if it can run at all. So that's kind of more in the software side. You can think about this more on the chemistry side of things, where it's like, we're going to try to actually see what the interaction is between, if we can develop a process that can elicit some kind of outcome. The third part, number C on this list here, is developing logical conclusions. So that means that you're actually taking time to look, it seems evident, but like to look at the results of your experiment and actually try to draw conclusions. And often those conclusions are then used to basically help advance your understanding, as we talked about before. Like you're taking some learnings, you're understanding why. And then, but it also could be a total failure. It could be that, you know, we thought that we had a solution that's going to work and it totally didn't work, but we're able to say that, you know, this pathway isn't successful. We have to come up with a different solution. But in the field, in the world of scientific discovery, the elimination of a possible path forward is actually advancing your knowledge of science, because it's saying that we now know this is not a solution that works, so we've narrowed down our options. And the fourth part is that, like, as a systematic investigation and, you know, conducting an experiment or doing analysis, just through that process, you have to kind of generate evidence of that. And that can really just be like the outcomes and like just keeping and storing the results from that experiment. And believe it or not, this is actually a really, really important factor that can be overlooked. But CRA is it's representing taxpayer dollars. They need to make sure that, you know, that we're not just handing out, you know, $4 billion to companies that have absolutely nothing to show for like in terms of evidence to support the idea that they were doing this work. So as you're, you know, in the future, as you're going through projects that might be eligible for SR&ED, it's a really good idea to think about what would back up and support the idea that we were doing this work. And that can take a lot of different forms. It's very sector specific. It can be things like code commits. It can be comments on, you know, iterations of software. In the field, it could be, you know, taking pictures of failed versions of your prototype or field tests that did not go successfully or did go successfully. And then any kind of like mathematical or otherwise analysis of data that is generated from the results of an experiment are very important to keep stored in a certain place. Okay, so we've really gotten through, I know that this team feels like we may not have covered a lot of ground, but we've covered a fairly significant part of just like what makes a project eligible. So I might pause here for any questions. Yeah, Abby, please go ahead.
So you're proposing that any experiment can get a funding?
Yeah, we're going to get through kind of some more details about the financial aspects and relationships with customers and so on. But maybe to take the context of your sector, it might be that you know, there's established ways to develop like, you know, a certain type of seed or a certain genetic kind of characteristic, but in the context of this specific area or type of seed or type of plant, it's unclear if we could isolate this type of characteristic, and we've had you know, difficulty getting that consistency in quality, and so we need to develop a protocol or a way, a process to I don't really know your sector too well, so I don't want to come across as being ignorant, but yeah, basically it's kind of like going beyond what is just very standard development or formulation within your sector. And anytime when there's basically, it's not quite clear how we're going to do this, and we need to do iterations of this in order to come up with a solution that's going to work. But the customer payment is a really critical piece of that, because if a customer is paying you to do that work and you're just acting as like an executor of that work, that's a different relationship because they're taking on the financial risk. But so yeah, we can get into that for sure. But sorry, did I initially answer your question? Do you want to expand upon your question?
Yeah, I mean, if I'll wait for next slide, so you know, I'll see if you have covered it or not, but I'll certainly come back because I have a question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So a couple of clues you might be doing SR&ED. This is just a quick rundown. So Erin, did you want to maybe speak to this one?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the key like notes that you're probably doing some pretty substantial science or experimentation, and it's new or novel, is you're applying for a patent, or you have patent that idea or tool or whatever it is. Another key indication, and kind of along the same trajectory, is you're publishing. You're either had the intention of publishing something or realized along the way that this was relevant knowledge to then be shared with the scientific community in some way, papers, presentations. publication of any sort. You're going to a conference and talking about this cool new thing that you struggled through and figured out. We also interact a lot with other kind of grant programs, IRAP being a pretty significant one, and NSERC as well. SHRED can kind of be thought of as an inverse grant. You have to prove to the CRA that you're eligible for this funding, and then you get it, whereas it's kind of the inverse for a grant. And there are some kind of nuances with SHRED interacting with grants. We don't want to what we call double dip. The CRA and the federal government is not interested in funding exactly what an IRAP grant may be funding. They can be related, but they will need to be separate in some ways. Another, I think, Abby, you mentioned that your SMEs, right? So being subject matter experts in a specific field, and having a team of professional engineers, PhDs, very specialized people that may be considered subject matter experts, that people are going to solve problems they can't otherwise solve. That's a great indication of that you're doing SHRED and you're kind of pushing the bounds of scientific knowledge. And the one that I was kind of mentioning before is that high rate of failure, or you're as a business having to invest a lot in kind of internal costs for research and design. Things are complicated and you're spending a lot of money trying to solve a problem. That's a very good indication that you're probably doing SHRED.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe Abby, with the question that you asked before, and it sounds like we'll get more into it, if the experiment you're doing is, sometimes if it's more like proof of concept, we're almost certain of what we think the result will be. That may not be a good indication of SHRED. It might be more like we're starting from scratch and we're getting to the point of proof of concept type thing. Then I would say like that's more closely related to SHRED. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the kind of projects I have been dealing with right now is more problem solving in the industry. We don't have a very, what do you call that, where everybody actually on the same boat, like they agree with what the scientific community actually want people to understand.
Yeah, like consensus or
the consensus is
broadly
missing.
universally accepted principles or whatever.
Yeah, so we are working heavily on bringing the seed industry to a minimum standard, and that actually needs a lot of internal research. And suppose that I have an idea, how is that idea being protected if I get funding from SHRED? Would that be on the website? Would my competitors and everybody else would know?
Yeah,
no, I completely, like Copoint, if we were ever to work together, it would be on like non-disclosure agreement, and the CRA is very serious. They house a lot of very important industry or trade secrets that they take that responsibility really seriously, and they protect it. The CRA's interest is advancing businesses or even small businesses in Canada doing incredible innovation. They don't want to harm that. So they take that very seriously. Yeah,
and we fall in small businesses. Actually, we have 28 employees, 2 different locations, but we are actually, as Erin mentioned, we are highly expert in the industry. Yeah, it's a challenge to get government funding at the same time because we are businesses. But we are always looking for some external funding because we are not on the stock market. It's a privately owned company, and it's difficult to get that much of money flow.
Well,
sorry to take your time.
I don't know exactly the specifics of your context, Abby, but if you're trying to kind of problem solve to get to some kind of minimal accepted standard, just hypothesizing what your research might entail, it could be you're trying to validate that a certain process elicits a consistent result, and you're needing to research and show that this is the reason why it's minimally accepted. you know,
Yeah, and
standard
why
or
we should
process.
move forward to a better level or standards. Yeah, we are trying to find or build that standard. Yeah.
So we'll probably, I mean, I may be getting ahead of myself, but we're happy to kind of take this offline in a place where you can speak a bit more freely about it, and we can talk about specifics in a way that you can get more clarity on whether or not your
Okay.
work does qualify.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, it's a little difficult sometimes to speak in generalities without getting into something you don't want to.
You bet.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
one last note, maybe before we leave, Elliot, and it sounds like it might not apply to you, Abby, but maybe for Paul's and Rosemary's interests as well. Sometimes it doesn't have to be new and novel for the whole industry. It can also be like, you know, Jane down the street seems to be killing it, and she's figured out some way to blow up balloons better than we can. We need to go down the road of how do we best blow up balloons and figure that out. And you're doing that. You have to do that independently. You don't know what Jane balloon blowing is doing down the street, and you have to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
That does qualify as well. Yeah.
Okay, well then I am pretty sure we'll be qualified then.
Yeah, I mean, Abby, just like, you know, I've been doing this for a number of years, and from what you're telling me, I think that there's definitely something there. So I think it's worth at least looking into. Yeah, and just to kind of put a finer point on what Aaron is saying, when you don't have all of the insights and IP that a competitor has, if you have some kind of idea of their end outcome, but you still have to go through your own process to get to that solution, that work is still kind of experimental and iterative and would qualify. You know, it's basically like, it doesn't need to be the first thing in the world that's ever achieved, you know, reach this certain outcome. It's kind of, you know, there's a lot of competitors in very competitive spaces, and they all might have very similar products, but they're operating in silos where their information is not publicly available to the general public or to each other. So they're all kind of going through their own journey in a way to develop their technology, and that work would qualify.
Totally. Thank you for that.
Sorry, did you speak to the last point about high rates of failure?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sweet. And I did kind of allude to this earlier, just to put a fine distinction between a technological uncertainty, which is the basis of the SHRED program, versus a business uncertainty, which is outside the scope of SHRED. So with the technical uncertainty, you know, there's certain elements of engineering, programming, mathematical analysis, incremental testing. This is different than when you're doing a project. There are certainly elements of the project which could fall into this technical or technological uncertainty bucket, but other work may not be, it may relate to the SHRED project, but it's not actual activity that we can claim for SHRED, which is stuff like marketing the product or doing aesthetic style changes, or kind of routine QA bug fixes in code. Like once you've, in the context of software, once you've really developed your core algorithms, your architecture, and so on, if you're just doing really quick little bug fixes of things that may not be working perfectly, you kind of resolve the uncertainty about like how you're going to do it and how it's going to perform, and now you're just kind of like ironing out the finest details or wrinkles. That's outside of SHRED. And then the other part too is like unclear product direction. This is a little bit more of a meaty subject, but if you're kind of starting off on square one and you're like, we could go in a million different directions as to how to solve this problem, and we're going to spend 3 months just kind of ruminating and spinning our wheels about where we're going to go with this, you haven't really identified what the knowledge gap is or what your solution is going to be. So that part is less eligible for SHRED. There is a lot of nuance to that, so I might not dive into it in great detail right now, but just as a I guess a flag for later. Great. So I think that with Resource YYC's background as being an organization that kind of came out of helping diversification and oil and gas, you know, engineers and geologists kind of diversify with the downturn. I think it is maybe helpful just to speak at a high level that energy innovation is a really big area that we see a lot of SHRED in. You know, there's a bunch, I won't go through all these lists, but there's a number of different sectors and areas within oil and gas, within decentralized energy, or within clean tech that are worth looking at. I think that we've kind of covered a lot of ground in terms of what makes a project qualify. And if you have something that is, seems to resonate with what we've talked about earlier, I think it's worth a conversation. So maybe breeze past this slide and kind of get to okay, so now we know there might be a project. The really core question is, okay, what does that mean? What do I get back? How do we claim? What can be claimed? So there are 4 general expenditure categories. I've broken up into 2 on each slide, just so it's not totally overwhelming. So the first 2 out of 4 are labor and contracts. This is really like the human resourcing and people part of it. So actually, sorry, Erin, did you want to speak to this slide?
Absolutely.
Keeping you on your toes.
Just keeping me on my toes. Yeah. Maybe one way to frame it is Elliot went through that how and why, and kind of a third kind of thing to consider when being like, should I submit for shred? Is there does need to be, a pretty good amount of money, either via labor or contracts, as it's listed here, or there's a couple of their criteria spent there to really be worth kind of pursuing shred. If you're just kind of starting and maybe haven't been paying yourself, or there's no actual T4 salaried employees, there may not be enough spend to really justify shred. But on the basic explanation of what these eligible expenses are, T4 salaries, you're paying your employees, that's happening on a regular basis. Contractors, so if you have a third party, this isn't necessarily you get 100% back of T4 salary or labor expenses, and contracts, if I'm not mistaken, is 80% back on those third party contracts. And the most important part here is it's work done in Canada. Same thing with your labor, Canadian based, and also there's differences between each province. So we're mostly speaking to the Alberta context. But if you have, I don't know, Abby, if you have an office outside of Alberta, there would be different kind of shred criteria or percentages on the provincial level, but speaking more broadly, labor and contracts will make up a significant part of a shred claim. And then the next 2 criteria, materials can be a really large part of a shred claim as well. So there are some nuances on what materials apply for your shred. But the main thing is that you had a experiment or an idea that you're testing, and the materials used in those tests that were maybe no longer useful or not going to be sold, that would be qualified for shred. And then a little bit of overhead. So there's a couple of ways of approaching overhead. Most commonly used is this proxy method. So it's essentially a percentage of what the number or like the dollar value of your labor contracts and materials that are deemed to be applicable to a shred filing. There's a certain percent of overhead that's also applicable as well on it's called a proxy basis. So that's something that Copoint would help navigate, determining of these 4 criteria for eligible expenses, what would be a defensible and reasonable, expense to put into your shred claim, and also helping to calculate what there's 2 paths for overhead and which one would be of most benefit to you and your company and your shred claim.
Yeah, usually when there's a very strong base of people that are being people's time that are being claimed, we have a lot of wages. The most simple approach is the accepted approach by CRA to say that 55% of these wages for shred are going to be attributed as overhead costs. So very simplistically, if you had $100,000 of wages that were spent or attributed to working on shred projects, then the CRA accepts us putting forward 55%, or in this case 55,000 as the overhead cost. So all in, we've got these four categories that kind of cover a lot of the bases. The things that you may notice are not on this list are things like capital costs. So the building of constructing a new building that's going to house some kind of R&D, that is an asset that's going to have enduring value. The government is not going to give a refund on that building. The same thing for kind of pieces of equipment, capital equipment that are installed within a facility, or some of the more enduring things like microscopes and other things that have enduring value. But a lot of the consumables that go into a facility or a lab can be claimed. The people and the bodies that are working on that stuff and then some of those overhead costs, it can really it can add up pretty substantially, pretty quickly. And then the question you might have is, okay, so I've got a project and I spent money, what do I get back? And so the bottom line is that for most smaller companies in Alberta, and by smaller, I mean less than $50 million in capital, which is most small, medium organizations, they will be getting back 40 to 48% back in cash on the cumulative amount of those expenditures we just talked about. So if you have $1 million of wages that are, from 10 different staff that are dedicated to R&D and so on, and you've got a bunch of materials, all those costs go into a bucket, and then 40 to 48% applied to that total number is what companies will get back from the SHRIP program. So that's why on the starting slide, I said that this is why this program matters, in the sense that it's a very beneficial program to help support businesses, and there's not really an associated risk with applying for it. Yeah, please, Abby.
So can you explain this again? So if I have a project and I spent money before getting the funding, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so okay, so I guess a critical part to explain that we haven't addressed yet is that this program operates through a company's corporate income tax filing. So we work with companies mostly on like a multi-year basis, where for each fiscal year that they go through, we make a discrete SHRED filing as a part of their tax return. So for a lot of companies right now, it's January, so we're talking to a lot of companies about the companies whose year ends were December 31st, 2022. So we're looking back at all the activities that happened in the year 2022 from Jan 1 to December 31st, and we're quantifying all the different discrete projects and the associated costs on a labor side, material side, what have you. And then we're going to roll that all up into a filing with their corporate income taxes that will be filed in a few months. And as a part of that tax filing, the CRA is going to issue a refund to those companies at the amount of 40 to 48% to kind of reimburse them for the costs that they had during the 2022 year.
Oh, okay. So it does not need to be, it has to integrate with your tax filing system, and CRA recognize those experiments or research as, as it will be qualified for what you call the SHRIP program.
Yeah,
so
that's right. Yeah.
How is it different from the other tax exempts government provide you on research funding and research work?
The other tax exemptions that government gives you?
I mean, I'm not sure, but I know few people who have started their companies, and you can get tax cuts on the research spending from the government.
Okay.
So I don't know how these two talk to each other, or if they talk at all.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess like if it's through an individual's tax filing, I'm not quite familiar with the personal income tax filing system, but from a corporate basis, the SHRED program is a really major way the government does compensate or reimburse companies for that work.
I think it is incorporated, so it is
Okay.
from a company.
Yeah, to be totally honest, I can't speak confidently to other ways that the corporate tax system reimburses for R&D expenditures. Like, I mean, it's very possible that we're talking about the same thing, because I feel like this is the major way that that the government incents R&D. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll not let your go. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I guess to also kind of anticipate maybe a question that may have been buried in your initial question, Abby. The government also, takes into consideration government grants. So Aaron was talking about the presence of other government grants. We do need to reduce the claim by just really simplistically, we generally have to take off other amounts of government funding. So if SDTC or Emissions Reduction Alberta, ERA, gives a company, $100,000 to do some R&D work, generally speaking, we need to reduce the claim size, the amount of expenditures that we're claiming by that government support. There are a whole bunch of nuances to how that happens and in what cases, but that all kind of gets factored in when we're doing the filing. Yeah. Okay, so maybe just to get a little bit more detailed, this is probably more detailed than is really necessary, but just so that you're aware, the reason why there's a range here of between 40 and 48% is that the Alberta program has kind of a sliding scale of different percentages that apply to different types of expenditures. It's a little bit more nuanced, but we're going to leave it there because the complexity is not really required at this point. But for most companies, a lot of companies are Canadian controlled private corporations. So that means that it's basically privately held and it is mostly controlled, like at the board level, the shares level, on a decision-making level by people who reside in Canada. And that is what allows them to be considered CCPCs. And that gives them the most elevated or the highest rate from the federal government. For companies that are not CCPCs, which means that they're either publicly traded on a stock exchange, or if they're controlled by a majority of people that are not Canadians, say like an American-based business, they would be qualified for a lower rate, but they still get money back. It's just a little bit different. But I think for the folks in the room, CCPCs would be the more relevant category. And then this is not a sales pitch, it's just generally to give you guys context on who we are, why Copoint's presenting. Some people confuse us as being, they might think that we are representing the government. We are not a government institution. Copoint is a private business, it's a family business that helps companies apply for the SHRED program and navigate that process. So I've just kind of detailed here that our services are from start to finish. It's kind of a turnkey solution through all phases of the SHRED cycle, which means, you know, identifying projects during your fiscal year, working with your teams on things like documentation, financial practices to optimize the claim and get as much money, like make sure that things are set up in a way that you can get the most money back. And then it comes to actually preparing and filing the claim. Our teams that we have half our team are technical, you know, PhD scientists, engineers, and so on, who do all the technical writing, the technical aspects of the project application. And then on the other side is the tax side of things. We've got a team of CPAs, accountants who do all the tax and numbers and financial elements of the filing. And then it goes into with your taxes, it gets received by CRA, and then they will assess your claim. And for most people who are claiming SHRED, most companies that are claiming SHRED, they typically have a meeting with CRA to kind of assess the eligibility of the claim. And we're there to kind of coach, prepare our clients for that meeting and that interaction. And then if there's any back and forth with CRA to kind of resolve any questions or any concerns from CRA, our team is the one to kind of to just quarterback that and do all that work. So that's kind of from soup to nuts, kind of, we just do everything SHRED is the bottom line. Aaron, anything to add to that? No, okay, great. Yeah, there's a couple of differentiators. Just we're focused on the net back for clients, really strong on audit defense. We have a lot of deep expertise. We've been operating for 30 years. We're the largest team of SHRED advisors west of Ontario. And we really are focused on client service, making sure we're handling all aspects of the claim. So I think that's pretty much it. I know it's been a conversation throughout the presentation, but we're at about 11:50. We've got about 10 minutes for any questions or discussion. Now we've kind of gone through most of it.
Well, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that information. I have a question. How many projects can you get funded at a time from the same company?
So there's no limit. We group projects based on shared technological uncertainties. So there could be 10 projects in your company that say just, you know, there's like 10 different types of seeds all within a certain the shared characteristics, and the end goal is you're trying to overcome a certain obstacle with all 10 of those projects. We might group those 10 together because there's a lot of shared elements, but there's no limitation on how many projects you can apply for. And then secondly, the interesting thing about this program is that there's no limit. So in contrast to grants, where there's like a specific pot of money that the granting agency has to disperse, with SHRED, the idea is that if you are doing eligible work and you've spent the money, then you should qualify for that refund. So it's kind of an entitlement program, like you're entitled to it if you're doing the work that qualifies. So there's really no cap. There is some caps on spend. So like this rate of 35% that the federal government gives, it only applies for the first $3 million of spend. But to be totally honest, it's fairly rare for private companies to be spending more than $3 million a year on dedicated R&D stuff without being over that taxable capital limit that I mentioned of 50 million. Usually, just a proportion of assets and spend, it's rare to have more than 3 million.
It's perfect. I would certainly talk to because I'm the molecular business development manager. I mean, we can take this offline if it is not relevant to other people, but certainly have to talk to my account manager who deals with all the taxes and money from the company or for the company. And I have to, tell them that this is there, or are they already using it? And I don't know it. So,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, that'd be great, Abby. Yeah, happy to take it offline and happy to send more details about what we do. I will say that like the big four accounting firms like KPMG, PwC, EY, and so on, they all kind of offer SHRED services as well, but we do think that there are some pretty key differentiators between what a dedicated specialist firm like ours does versus what a bigger firm where it's kind of like one of many services they provide. So yeah, I think it sounds like your company could definitely, it's definitely worth the conversation to explore.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone's participation. Yeah, Abby, we can connect offline. Paul, if there's any questions you have, let us know either now or you can follow up with us later. Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Rosemary, for hosting, and appreciate Resource YYC having us in. And yeah, we'll look forward to hopefully seeing everybody at the Peers and Beers networking event when it happens down the road.
Yeah. Well, we're still planning on hosting those Friday afternoons 4 to 5 p.m. So if people are interested, we're happy to have people come by and, get networking again, which is always great. And yeah, in case anybody's interested, Resource YYC is a co-working space where we, provide networking in a community. So if you're interested in having somewhere to drop by or need some meeting rooms or a permanent office, come check us out. And thank you, Elliot and Aaron, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you, everyone who joined. And I hope anybody who watches this recording later could get a lot of information out of it.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.